Hi everyone, my name is Astha Kapoor. This is my colleague Aditi. We are co-authors of the paper that we're presenting, which is submission number 100. It's called Principles for Revenue Models and Sustainability of a Data Steward. We're from the Aapti Institute and have been working on the idea of data stewardship and the role of data stewards for a while. We think, next slide, we basically think that the idea of data stewardship is at the heart of a new, just, and fair social contract for data, which is increasingly being discussed. So there's a realization that the current norms and practices around data are unfair. Discourses and norms do not adequately capture the complexity of the data economy. We think of data collection and control that is concentrated, and power around that is concentrated, and value is not distributed adequately across stakeholders. And therefore, we think that there's a need for a new social contract for data, which explores economic structures, which thinks of distributing value, and also thinks of questions around non-economic harms in the current data paradigm. And through all of this, we arrive at data stewardship, which is basically a mechanism to distribute the value of data, to understand and develop mechanisms on how data can be unlocked while safeguarding the privacy of people. With that, we came up with a framework where we define different kinds of data stewardship models. We think that there are broadly, four major models: data trusts, data exchanges, collaboratives, account aggregators, and personal data stores. Each of these have different kinds of access and use mechanisms, and also imagine the role of the steward differently. And also note that these models may vary on based on use cases. So the steward that is unlocking data for health research is very different from a steward that is unlocking mobility data for innovation with startups. Similarly, a steward whose purpose it is to empower individuals to control their data is very different from a steward that imagines better community ownership of data. So we recognize the complexity of this field, but one of the questions that we keep coming back to is, if stewards were to exist in the wild, then what would their revenue models be? How would they sustain themselves? Because we think that, stewards must have sustainable models that are not necessarily governed by the ways in which they monetize data, etc. So we think that the role of the steward is to negotiate with tech companies on behalf of individuals and community, empower individuals and community to make better decisions with data, and unlock the value, as I mentioned, to make sure that the value of data is being distributed across. And this conversation has been picking up, like I said, it's coming up in the context of obviously value in the works of Mariana Mazzucato, for instance, but also more and more about monopolies around antitrust, etc. Like, what is the value of data and how can we distribute it further? So given this context, given that the stewards will be stewarding something of value, we think that they need an independent revenue model. They cannot be just extractive in the way that data brokers are right now. They need to make sure that they don't benefit from the data. And a steward must find, to that end, an independent revenue stream so that they are not co-opted by data acquirers, by tech companies. And with this in mind, we started to think through the different roles of the steward, the different kinds of values, and started to think through some of the frameworks that we will discuss in our paper on the possibilities of data, of revenue models for data stewards. So one is, if we think of data as a public good that needs to be stewarded, whether, and the idea of data as commons is coming up quite a bit. And the idea is that, this data that we know now that benefits a few handful of tech companies is actually something that has been created through a lot of investment of the government. It needs to, be used in the interest of the public. And there needs to be a business model that comes, or a revenue model that comes around this, that can actually interpret data as commons and then structure itself so that it can generate societal value. The second is if the steward is thinking of collective bargaining. As I mentioned, the role of the steward could also be to negotiate on behalf of communities with technology company, and the size of these communities could vary. It could be small in the context of a small village that owns its own data, or it could be a collection of stewards that work on behalf of a broader community. But basically, we think that this is also an important way of thinking about it, because data at the end of the day is in some ways the labor of people who perform this labor online and benefit from it. And the role of the steward can be imagined as a union that is stewarding data and negotiating and representing people in the way that labor unions have done historically. So in this context, when we think of collective bargaining as a role that the steward can play, we think of data as labor, and therefore think of revenue models that are based on the union models. And finally, one of the other ways that we've imagined data is that as an asset to an individual. Each individual can use their data to empower themselves, and therefore need some intermediary, in the same way as in the financial world you have investment advisors who advise you on how to maximize your profit, how to safeguard your interests. We also think that there's a need for a steward that can be in some ways a data advisor. And in this context, we examine and extrapolate the business model of financial intermediaries. Those are the three big sort of frames that we have adopted in this paper. And it's not a perfect analysis, because data is a complex resource, and also stewardship, because it's related to data, is going to take multiple formats. So we think that the revenue models should be based on the kind of purpose or the intent of the steward. So I will hand it over now to my colleague Aditi to take us through the details of each of these models.
Yeah, so we first start with diving into, as Astha mentioned earlier, thinking about data as commons and public good stewardship. So in this section, we go a little bit deeper into how these stewards operate in the real world, and what public good stewards look like. So we specifically look at trust ports in Scotland, the public dividend fund in Alaska, which is very similar to the universal basic income model. And then we look at community land trusts, and we do a deep dive into each of these three types of what we consider real world stewards, and try to extrapolate principles for revenue models that can then be applied to data through them. So the commons approach to data governance, like Astha mentioned, has been circulated and has been circulating in the data governance world for some time. And there are several parallels between data and public good resources. Firstly, data is a resource which many people can use simultaneously and for varying purposes. It is non-depletable, non-competitive. So one entity to draw value from data does not interfere with another's. And data is also a resource that is more valuable when packaged together, rather than siloed or broken down. And so it benefits from network effects, and the network accrues greater value as more people join in. And so by taking this approach, or the commons lens to data, we develop principles for revenue models of stewardship that distribute benefits of data widely, without commodifying or privatizing these goods. And in the following sections of this presentation, we'll explore a little bit more about what types of stewards take a commons-like approach to stewardship of public goods, and examine the revenue models a little bit deeper. So we start with the case of the trust port models in Scotland. Scotland's coastal ports are home to a vast amount of economic activity, from renewable energy generation to cruise activities. And trust ports are designed to manage a variety of these commercial activities. They are independent bodies, but they are legally recognized by the state. And trust ports operate with, as we have outlined here a stakeholder board governance relationship in which the board is held accountable to the users of the port, such as local community members, port users, regional or local authorities, who pay a fee or harbor dues to the board, and then the board is responsible for maintaining operations of the port. And essentially their goal is profit generation from the port. They seek to maximize profits, but all of these profits are redistributed back to maintaining operations of the port. And so in this way, this is a useful example for independent revenue generation of data stewards and a combination of asset utilization and fees. And it also highlights the importance of active engagement from the community. And this is especially critical because, it takes into account the varying interests of different stakeholders and is also able to, they're also able to remain sustainable in this way. And the second example that we look at is the Alaska Permanent Dividend Fund, which, as I mentioned, mimics the universal basic income model. So the Alaskan government established a fund in which the state deposits royalties it really receives from mineral reserves, such as minerals, oil, gas, and then these royalties are collected by the board and managed and invested in global and domestic stocks, and interests are then and they accrue interests, and these interests or the surplus is then redistributed to citizens. The citizens receive a monetary compensation in the form of an annual dividend. And similarly, the Alaska board has a legal designation, and they also mirror the independent fiduciaries of a data trust, which is one of the models that we mentioned, that Astha had mentioned earlier, in which trustees are bound to a fiduciary obligation of undivided loyalty and exercise rights on behalf of the trustee's beneficiary. So we see this as kind of an interesting example of that fiduciary relationship, and also a way in which a revenue model or revenue structure can be applied to a data trust, because this has not been very widely explored. As we mentioned before, there haven't been a lot of real world examples of how this works. So we see this as kind of a parallel to that system. And the last model of public good stewardship is community land trusts, which serve as a good model for governance structure and stakeholder representation in the fee to entity model. So community land trusts are usually nonprofit entities who acquire land or housing that they own and then lease to local communities for community development, in order to grow communities, to benefit citizens and stakeholders, in order to provide affordable rent or housing or land development. And these individuals and community members pay a fee to the board and also pay money for leasing the property. But they also get, the benefit of getting cheaper rent. And community land trusts are interesting because they are the nonprofit structure. They rely on grant funding often to get started in their earlier years, either through private sources like foundations or through public sector funding. But as they begin generating revenue internally, this is done through ground lease fees or membership dues, fees for service. And this covers a lot of their basic stewardship responsibilities. So again, an example of an independent board stakeholder relationship that does not rely on external third-party funding and is able to maintain the interests of the citizens or of the stakeholders. And the interesting part about community land trusts especially is their board structure, in which they have representation from a diverse group of communities and individuals. On their board is divided evenly between members leasing land from community land trusts, government officials, public representatives. So we see this as, and also an important principle for the structure of a board. And so it's clear that from all of these three models, all models of stewardship cannot be applied equally in all instances. It's important to note that the function of a steward and its intent and is linked to the revenue model, and so must be chosen accordingly. And so we imagine public good stewardship to be for a steward that will imbibe some of these principles, that will be that is more public in nature. And in cases where data is treated as a more commonly owned good, and aggregating data sets that maybe address challenges for urban planning or transportation, or mobility. And so I think something that we've seen across all three of these models is that a data commons steward needs to understand the interests of stakeholders and match their actions accordingly. And this can also be actionized through a board stakeholder relationship that maintains that independent relationship. Yeah, and that is that. I'll pass it back to Astha to talk about union models.
Thanks, Aditi. It's interesting because even within regarding data as commons, there are multiple ways in how the steward can be structured and the revenue model. And also in this case, we're looking at, when we're looking at data as commons, you're looking at multiple stakeholders, whereas data as labor is looking at a certain community that needs to be in a certain way stewarded, and the data needs to be. And also the function of the data steward, as we discussed earlier, is largely about protecting the interests of the community. So that defines the business model. So the reason, just to quickly touch upon this, is the reason that we thought that this would be an interesting model to explore with regard to data stewardship is because union models historically have worked to look at negotiations with companies. And I think and we think that in this moment, that's also part of what the steward should be doing, asking for fairer compensation, as we discussed, on the value of data, encouraging competition, so de-incentivizing, a certain kind of profit that tech companies make of data, rethinking consent frameworks, because individual and individual-centric consent is largely broken. So how do we think more about community consent for questions of data and privacy? So we think that fundamentally this could be the basis of this model could be collective data ownership, increase in transparency, bargaining power for communities, collective or group privacy, which we also think is something that's coming up quite a bit. But and then moving away from ideas of digital colonialism, which is we are in service of a certain greater power, which in this case is tech companies, and exploitation of our labor as workers on the platform economy, or not platform economy, but on as we use platforms. So there are existing examples of data unions that are trying to work around this. There's something called the Data Union that is trying to build efforts with activists, businesses, and politicians to enable greater ownership of data in this way. There's also a Data Workers Union, which is looking at our datafied society and trying to see how workers on platforms such as Uber or Lyft could be, in greater control of their data. And also, there are other organizations and efforts such as Streamer and Data Corp, which are doing similar stuff. But the idea is, like I said, to find a way in which data can be viewed as a collective resource, and a space where action can be taken by a union or a representative of the group, and in a way that they can negotiate for the rights of the group, on behalf of them. So that, I think, is the way that this moves to the idea of the revenue model is that we are looking largely at a union dues or a fee-based model, in which, like in the case of unions, traditional unions, employees or workers pay a small due to the union, which is made up of representatives, and then the union simply negotiates, not simply, it's a complex process, but negotiates on behalf of the collective with the with the employee or employer. So in this case, I mean, the way we imagine it is that there would be a possibility that, say for instance, if there are workers on Uber, they could have a data union that works on their behalf with in negotiating their relationship with Uber as the data company itself. And the way that we think about it is that this allows the unions to be paid for by workers, or people in this case. It also makes sure that the steward is not able to monetize the data. It is always structured such that it works in the best interest of the community or people or the group, because it is paid for and incentivized to do that. It could, as I mentioned, collect fees. It could, if there are any excesses, it could be used to sustain the union. Stewards are therefore independent, and the membership structure is critical to this, which is that the membership structure of the union allows this, steward to be entirely catered to the interests of the community, and also be made up of representatives of the community in some ways. So ideally, like in the case of a traditional union, you have worker representatives who are part of the union because they understand that experience, and that's how we envision the data steward to also function in this case. And then I think we just go on to the next model, which is data as an asset.
Yeah, so the our last framing is data as an asset. And for this one, we look at financial intermediaries, which are located between users and third parties to manage the funds or financial assets of individuals. And we look at this framing because people should ultimately be able to decide how their data is being used and ensure principles of transparency and accountability from governments and platforms especially, and data as an asset that we believe needs to be leveraged in the interests of people. And the financial advisor model is interesting because advisors manage assets on behalf of users and provide advisory services to understand how to best optimize the asset. And so this function and relationship can be extrapolated, we believe, to data stewardship, imagined as data advisors that work for users and ensure that their data is being unlocked in the service of the individual. And so there are many types of financial advisors. There are brokers, dealers, financial coaches. Investment advisors are the only type of financial advisor with a legal designation certified by the state. So this, similar to public good stewardship, adds a layer of accountability that we believe, and legal regulation that we believe is critical. And for that reason, we refer to investment advisors in particular for much of our analysis. And fiduciaries, they usually have fiduciaries who owe clients their undivided loyalty, and they may not engage in any activity that conflicts with the client's interests and consent. And so the thing that's also interesting about financial intermediaries is there's two most common types of fee structures. There's commission-based and fee-only. And commission-based financial advisors can take money from other third-party sources, but fee-only acts in the interests of the client specifically because they only take payment from the client, and so they're obligated to the client to by fiduciary loyalty. And so we look at this model of financial intermediaries, specifically investment advisors with fee-only revenue structures. And so the model for financial intermediaries also makes really apparent the intimate link between revenue model and intent. And in a fee-only structure, because the investment advisor is obligated to directly serve the client, provide advice, and review all their investments and disclose any conflict of interest to the clients based on their single source of revenue, which is the fee. They are obligated, and so we see the fee-only structure of a financial intermediary to be the one that translates best to data stewardship and accounts for greater accountability. But beyond revenue generation, we also see these intermediaries providing important lessons for the value of professionalism in management of assets such as data, and the value in having a certified professional, manage your assets, as opposed to, maybe a union model where the steward is not necessarily professionally trained. And so this can also be kind of translated interestingly into the model of account aggregators, which is a India-based model of data stewardship, and is a data exchange layer that holds data, and can benefit from that we believe can benefit from a fee-only structure for data stewardship. And so I will pass it now back to Astha to talk a little bit about how we pull up some principles from all of these models, from the framings of data as commons, labor, and assets.
So I think, one of the things then, that's been clear to Aditi and I in all of this is that there are no single answers, which is obviously always a strange place to arrive at after a piece of work. But I think that what we have learned is that intent or to steward is critical. We also think that stewards should always be in service of the group, community, individual that they are stewarding on behalf of. And therefore, I think, part of that is, being responsible to, the responsibility to steward is inherent to its nature in a certain way, and that is part of the core for any data steward to do its job well. We also think that stewards, like in the case of financial intermediaries, must have some kind of recognition from the law. It should be a space that's regulated. It should be a space that puts in place things like best interest, conflict of interest, all of these things should be derived and put into a certain kind of regulation. We recognize that that's a little while away, but will also help make sure that the steward is able to generate revenue in a responsible way if it is regulated by law. The third is value distribution. We think that stewardship, in whatever shape or form, exists to enable a better generation, better distribution of value in the data economy. We think that, there is a huge amount of value in terms of which is lying latent with data or is being monopolized by some companies. So the role of the steward is fundamentally to distribute this value to its stakeholders. Also accountability, and we think that this is linked intimately to the way that the business model will be structured. If the steward is indeed benefiting from the users they represent, there will be a greater degree of accountability. So we think that the fact that, as Aditi just mentioned, the fee-based model or the union dues or the distribution in the way that it's imagined, the commons question, those systems allow for greater accountability of the steward. And then finally, sustainability, which is that in sustainability, we think that while there may be some in the initial near term, we might need grant investments to kick stewards off the ground, they should be fundamentally sustainable. And that by that we mean financial sustainability that should be structured outside in the way that we've defined the revenue models and should be linked to the users that the steward represents. So those are the high level principles that we have derived from this. And I think that we recognize that there's a need to test this idea better. There's a need to test some of these revenue models. We need more examples of data stewardship in different ways to be experimented, to be tested, to be, there's a need to create knowledge around this so that in the next couple of years, as regulation moves, we are able to put together something that actually puts the responsibility or the idea of responsibility of a steward and its independence very centrally to the regulation.
Yeah, and I think just to add on to that, I think, like Astha mentioned, while these may be imperfect models, I think this research has also really helped highlight the, it helped us imagine a variety of different stewards and their use cases. And I think even within models of trusts, data trusts or data collaboratives, there can be a variety of revenue structures based on use case and intent. And I think that there are, there's a lot of research to be done even within the types of stewards that we have imagined for how different design principles can apply and maybe overlap with different models of stewardship.